Hey everybody, this is a piece by a Mario Montano. The piece is titled, the quote, Scientific Dialectics of Galvano Della Volpe. The reason I'm reading this is that I think in Italy, Galvano Della Volpe was a very important voice in post-war receptions of Marxian theory on a high level. And I don't really know much about him. It's very as opposed to other people say like Althusser, who have a lot of secondary resources on them, because there was just like it was just such a sensation and intellectual trend. Not that it means it's vacuous, but it was very much a trend. It was a fad that doesn't seem like it seems like it kind of sort of came and went. Um, Work secondary literature on Galvano della Volpe is scarce. And you might say, why not just read Galvano della Volpe um, by on his own? And the reason is that I'm looking for breadth and not depth. So I've kind of been reading things like, I want to read like the secondary literature on Rozdalsky and Rubel, Althusser, Hal Draper, those kinds of things, Marx interpreters. I don't want to sit down, and I don't really feel the particular need to go through their entire works on their own. I'm trying to get a flavor. Anyway, I don't know why I needed to give that whole preface to what I'm reading, why I'm reading this, but I should probably get some friends. Anyway, until the mid-1960s, the name of Galvano della Volpe was rarely mentioned in the theoretical debates of the international left. Then in 1965, Erich Fromm's, quote, International Symposium on Socialist Humanism, that book is on this channel, featuring works by Goldman, Senghor, Marcuse, Petrovich, Dolci, among others, published Della Volpe's essay, The Legal Philosophy of Socialism. It should be on this channel. If it's not, that's an error on my part. This, along with Per la teoria di un umanismo positivo, 1949, seemed to place him in a well-known context, the Italian counterpart of the Yugoslav Praxis Group and of Fromm's own, quote, school. Since then, however, the image of these Italian, quote, humanists has been questioned. As the names of Della Volpe and Coletti began to appear occasionally in New Left Review, it became known that their theory placed a unique emphasis on, quote, science. Louis Althusser himself expressed his respect for Della Volpe's, quote, scholarly, rigorous, and deep, end quote, works. A new label, quote, neo-positivist Marxism, end quote, was coined to describe the work of a group of writers which included Della Volpe, Coletti, and Althusser. A vague image of supposed similarities between the Italian and the French political situations reinforced this idea. More recently, other factors have aroused curiosity about Della Volpe. The stagnation of the student movement and a wave of wildcat strikes reaching back to 1967 have led the New Left to rediscover Marxism and with it, though to a much lesser degree, the existence of the working class. In 1968, the French general strike forced the, quote, movement into the awareness of its own political and intellectual isolation. This feeling was reinforced by Italy's, quote, creeping May, a long period of labor unrest culminating in a massive strike at the multinational giant Fiat. And, quote, labor news from Italy has continued to dominate the headlines. It is only natural that this new political climate should arouse interest in present-day French and Italian Marxism. It would not be surprising if the recent translations of Louis Althusser and Antonio Gramsci are soon followed by translations of the work of Della Volpe and Coletti. It may well be the destiny of philosophy that its political impact always arrives post festum. I think that's true. I mean, I think Della Volpe has and Coletti have text published. I think it was like Verso, like New Left Review did like publish their books, or like New Left books. Like I have a piece on here at least from Coletti's book, which is like, I don't know. Is it Coletti that's like from Marx to Rousseau? Or that's someone else? I can't remember. Anyway, Galvano della Volpe died in 1968. His philosophical reflection has little connection with the present political wave. His major works belong to the 40s and 50s. His interest in Marx dates back to 1943. Before this date, he wrote on a wide range of topics: Italian idealism, David Hume, Hegel, and Romantic aesthetics, to mention a few. His conversion to Marxism brought him into the ranks of the Italian Communist Party. His political membership demonstrates the same quiet detachment as his academic affiliation. To the party, he was, quote, a scholar. To the university, a, quote, communist. Sorry, I got distracted. I had to reread something. Before 1943, Galvano Della Volpe wrote on a wide range of topics: Italian idealism, David Hume, Hegel, and Romantic aesthetics, to mention a few. His conversion to Marxism brought him into the ranks of the Italian Communist Party, PCI. His political membership demonstrates the same quiet detachment as his academic affiliation. To the party, he was, quote, a scholar. To the university, a, quote, communist. While he did not become the PCI's philosophical spokesman, his political outlook was substantially in agreement with the, quote, official line. Della Volpe's works were well known among the young party intellectuals, and in the early 60s, when a new political ferment pushed many intellectuals outside the PCI toward a, quote, new left, they brought along Della Volpe's main works. His rigorous thought seemed to provide an end to the unprincipled ideology of a party that was moving in a social democratic direction. Thus, Della Volpe's relationship to the present radical left is at best indirect. The new forms of working class organization and the political content of its struggles cannot be learned from him. What Della Volpe does offer us can be fully understood only in the context of the Marxist theoretical debate which took place between the two wars. Its historical setting shows its own theoretical relevance to the present. From the 1920s until the Cold War, two schools dominated the Marxist scene: the, quote, dialectical materialism of the Stalinist interpreters and the European and American, quote, official counterparts, and the so-called, their European and American, quote, official counterparts, and the so-called, quote, Western Marxism, a very general label which covered, to mention a few, Lukash's History and Class Consciousness, Karl Korsch's book Marxism and Philosophy, Sartre's own, quote, Marxist phase, and the French followers and exegetes of Lukash's philosophical reflection. I don't know who that's referring to. However great their political differences, particularly with regard to their divergent attitudes toward the Stalinist model and toward, quote, bourgeois culture, and however different their respective, quote, fields of interest, for the, quote, Russians, the establishment of a system of universal, quote, dialectical laws; for the, quote, Westerners, an anti-scientist and anti-positivistic discussion of the problem of man's alienation. A clean delineation is made somewhat difficult by the fact that, theoretically, they share an important philosophical source and a ground, a common Hegelian matrix. If the universal dialectical laws of, quote, dialectical materialism are the mere transcription of the triadic structures found in Hegel's logic, Lukash's concept of, quote, reification, and Korsch's proposal of the category of, quote, totality are both conscious resumption of Hegel's, quote, totality and, quote, alienation. I just read a book by Patrick Good who says that Korsch doesn't really particularly use the concept of totality or develop it as rigorously as Lukács does. I think also a major difference is that when talking about, from my understanding at least, that whereas opposed to like the Western Marxists who made their Hegelian credential or their Hegelian reception of Marx explicit and self-consciously aware of that, the Soviet bloc, to my understanding, even if they, on the level of theory, actually had a very like Hegelian approach to Diamat or whatever, they buried that influence. They didn't acknowledge it. The official line on Hegel in the Stalinist period that he was like a thoroughly reactionary figure. Both Marxism assume a continuity between Hegel and Marx, as detected in the, quote, dialectic. The historical precedent for such an interpretation probably lies in the distinction proposed in Engels' Ludwig Feuerbach of 1886 between Hegel's conservative system and his dialectical method. Between Hegel's conservative system and his dialectical method. For Engels, the system must be rejected, but the method has to be saved. That is, Marx seems simply to have inherited ready-made Hegel's dialectical method, stripped of its reactionary results, the quote, system. Della Volpe radically disagrees with the supposed smooth continuity. To do so, Della Volpe has to show that in Hegel such a separation is not possible. More important, he must find such proof in Marx himself, both the quote, young Marx and the quote, mature, in the form of the immediate connection between Hegel's dialectical method and his conservative philosophical results. But before entering this discussion, the political implications of Della Volpe's reflections must be made clear. Caught between its Soviet and Western alternatives, Marxism had lost touch with one of the most crucial aspects of the historical materialist perspective, the critical and scientific analysis of the concrete process of social production, i.e. the study of the historical development of capitalism and its social classes. What the Marxism of the quote, dialecticians seemed to have lost was nothing less than the real working class as a concrete, dynamic, and quote, empirical entity. To be sure, as a philosophical category and an ideological reference, the quote, working class had been quite alive both in Western and Soviet Marxism. It had, for example, appeared as the quote, subject-object of Lukács and as the empirical carrier of all general laws of quote, dialectical materialism, when quote, applied to society. But its concrete internal structure, the real forms of its worldwide development, and the historical models of its own self-activity have been gradually shifting out of the Marxist theoretical focus. That the dialectical formalism of the Russians should have prevented a concrete critical analysis of the Soviet mode of production from the point of view of the workers is not surprising, considering that the golden years of quote, dialectical materialism were also the years of Stalin's quote, industrialization, that is, the systematic extraction of surplus value from the Soviet workers by their Communist Party leaders. So this guy seems like he's probably going to be critical of Della Volpe to my extent, because generally speaking, what he just described is fundamentally, he's like, yeah, the state capitalism of the Soviet Union. So I'm assuming if he believes that the USSR is state capitalist, he'd very, very much be he's probably going to be critical of things that reek of like dogmatic diamat, but that's just my guessing. Anyway, that the dialectical formalism of the Russians should have prevented a concrete critical analysis of the Soviet mode of production from the point of view of the workers is not surprising, considering that the golden years of quote, dialectical materialism were also the years of Stalin's quote, industrialization, that is, the systematic extraction of surplus value from the Soviet workers by their communist leaders. Quote, Western Marxism, however, was no more successful in reviving Marx's tools of concrete social analysis, for in its attempt to restore Marx's theory, it chose to focus solely on his, quote, method, that is, the, quote, dialectic. As a result, the critical and scientific potential of historical materialism vanished into dialectical and methodological speculation. Della Volpe's historical contribution to the development of this century's theoretical Marxism has been to propose an interpretation of historical materialism that would again turn it into a crucial cognitive tool capable of true class analysis and prediction. Though fully conscious of the theoretical importance of his interpretive work, Della Volpe did not choose the path of open political opposition to the two dominant schools. Reasons of sheer political expediency may have determined the, quote, shaded mood of his cautious philosophical disagreements, for, quote, dialectical materialism was still the dominant ideology of the Communist Party of Italy. It is also possible that Della Volpe himself was not fully aware of all the political implications of his reading of Marx. In any case, it is certainly a fact that, as I have shown elsewhere, in his more political works, Della Volpe's fundamental theoretical disagreement turns into an outright defense of the official line. Della Volpe's philosophical works have helped educate a whole new generation of Marxists, rediscovering historical materialism as a tool of concrete research. Such a rediscovery would have hardly been possible without Della Volpe's peculiar style. Della Volpe reads Marx. Soviet Marxists, on the other hand, had a legacy to revive and a justifying Weltanschauung to construct, worldview to construct. For them, the easy formulas of, quote, dialectical materialism, the quote, negation of the negation, the turning of quantity into quality, and the like, had an advantage over Marx's own thought. They could be applied to all conceivable situations, thus proving the, quote, philosophical superiority of the party's viewpoint. Quote, Western Marxists, on the other hand, had often to mediate between their own philosophical past and the left-wing political concerns which came out of a new quest for, quote, relevance. Neither needed Marx, really. In an international milieu characterized by all kinds of revisions, reassessments, and partial restorations of Marx's thought, Della Volpe chose for himself a role of modesty. He would simply be a reader. This was itself a big job, which could not be performed through official, quote, portraits of Marx. This explains Della Volpe's, quote, philological emphasis, his painstakingly rigorous style, patient theoretical mood, and the unique quality of his work, which substitutes for easy, modish brilliance the thoughtful intelligence of the loving interpreter. Finally, it explains the problems we face as readers. To read Della Volpe means immediately to read Marx. Della Volpe has two main points of departure. One, the cognitive failure of Hegel's dialectic, as proven by Marx, and of mystified, quote, speculative dialectic in general, as the idealist philosophical method which dissolves historical reality into pure thought, and two, the cognitive success of Marx's own method, quote, scientific dialectic, as proven by his critique of political economy, and the success of the scientific experimental method in general, both in the natural sciences since Galileo and in the social sciences since Marx. According to Della Volpe, Marx has given us all the elements of a critical identification of the essence of the idealist speculative dialectic, in terms of its own logical mechanism, its mode of abstraction, its concepts, and its philosophical assumptions. In addition, Marx can provide us with a new discoursal method which makes us aware of the reasons for the deep cognitive wealth of historical materialism and of the experimental method in general. From this we will be able to draw rules for the future. Since historically as well as theoretically, Marx's method developed in a constant dialogue with and in opposition to Hegel's philosophy, Della Volpe's critique of idealism and his interpretation of Marxism as science must take the form of a historico-philological reconstruction of Marx's methodological works. Before following the process of this reconstruction, let us consider its main steps. Quote, hypostatization, or quote, substantification of thought is for Della Volpe the fundamental logical mechanism of idealism's dialectic. First, speculation reduces reality to an idea. Then it takes this idea as reality itself, that is, substantifies it. Thus, hypostatization implies an inversion of reality and idea, of matter and mind, of subject and predicate, or in Hegel's terminology, of finite and infinite. The essence of this inversion, according to Della Volpe, is outlined in Marx's book, Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of the State of 1843, and in the well-known economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. The reduction of reality to ideas is the necessary premise of hypostatization, and is made possible by a particular mode of abstraction, indeterminate or generic abstraction, which disposes of or abstracts from all determinate specific concrete traits and focuses on indeterminate generic abstract features alone. It involves the disposal of all essential differences in the name of the general and common, or in the name of the idea. Against idealism's generic indeterminate abstractions, Della Volpe proposes a specific or determinate abstraction. The concepts and categories used in Marx's Capital, quote, abstract labor, quote, capitalist production, and all the like, are examples of determinate abstractions, for they refer to specific, definite, determinate mode, a specific, finite, determinate mode of production. In other words, a determinate abstraction is essentially historical, and so is the process of scientific production itself, which arises from history and must be verified in history. All scientific production, therefore, must follow the experimental method and develop out of hypotheses and verifications. This is the method of the, quote, scientific dialectic, of which Marx speaks explicitly with regard to the poverty of philosophy, the book, in which he discusses more fully in the 1857 introduction to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy of 1859. Let us now take up Della Volpe's historical reconstruction, beginning with the critique of Hegel's philosophy of the state. Marx's commentary on paragraphs 261 to 269 of Hegel's philosophy of the state concerning the deduction of the transition from the family and civil society to the state is in Della Volpe's consideration crucial. Marx says, quote, family and civil society are grasped by Hegel as conceptual spheres of the state, is the state which divides itself into them, and does this, quote, in order to leave behind its ideality and to become explicitly infinite actual spirit, end quote. Hegel. Here the logical pantheistic mysticism is strikingly apparent. The idea is thoroughly subjectivized, quote, substantified, end quote. Della Volpe comments, quote, or hypostatized, end quote, end bracket. Family and civil society are the presuppositions of the state. They are really the active forms. But in speculation this is reversed. As the idea is subjectivized, the actual subjects, civil society, family, etc. become objective moments of the idea, end quote. Marx. The real actual determinations, quote, are left just as they are, but at the same time acquire the meaning of a determination of the idea, a result, a product of the idea, end quote. What is the first? The real subject, civil society, family, and the like, becomes a second, a predicate, while the real predicate, the state, or the idea, appears as a logical first. When the idea, the predicate, is substantified, reality, or the real subject, appears as a product. Reality becomes a result of the idea. Quote, Hegel's assertions simply mean family and civil society are parts of the state. Citizens of the state are members of families and members of civil society, end quote. In reality, therefore, quote, family and civil society are actual parts of the state. They are the state's particular mode of existence. Family and civil society themselves comprise the state, end quote. Marx. Sorry. Marx. In Hegel's speculation, however, quote, they are produced by the actual idea, bracket, as the state, end bracket. It's not their own life that binds them into the state, rather, it is the life of the idea that has discerned them from itself, They owe their particular existence to a spirit different from their own, their determinations made by a third party, not self-determinations, end quote. Marx. This point is crucial. Here, quote, the entire mystery of Hegel's philosophy of law and of his philosophy in general is laid out, end quote. Marx. For Hegel, all that matters is, quote, finding for the particular concrete definitions the corresponding abstract ones, end quote. Marx. The reversal of subject and predicate implies a reversal of reality and thought. Quote, Hegel does not develop his thinking from this object, but he develops the object by his thinking, end quote. Marx. Della Volpe finds two main contributions here. First, the understanding that if the method of speculative dialectic consists in the idealist reversal of subject and predicate, of reality and idea, the actual result of this method is no, quote, empty concept, as in Feuerbach's criticism of Hegel. On the contrary, it results in a, quote, vicious fullness of empirical contents, which remain unmediated or undigested, precisely because they are merely transcended by generic, i.e. perceived a priori abstractions. On the contrary, it results in a, quote, vicious fullness of empirical contents which remain unmediated or undigested, precisely because they are merely transcended by generic, i.e. preconceived, a priori abstractions. End quote. Della Volpe. Hegel, as we have just seen, leaves the real determinations, quote, as they are, end quote. But at the same time, Hegel makes the real determinations appear as determinations of the idea, or manifestations of the spirit itself. The conservative nature of this process should be apparent. Take Marx's comment on Hegel's paragraph 279. On the left side of the page, Marx writes the real, empirical statement. On the right side, he has Hegel's speculative reversal. Hegel's speculative reversal. And there's like a chart here. Not like a chart, but two like headings. On the left, it says common man. The common man. The monarch possesses sovereign power, sovereignty. Sovereignty does what it wants to do. On the right, under Hegel, it says the sovereignty of the state is the monarch. The sovereignty of the state is the monarch. Sovereignty is the, quote, abstract and hence underground self-determination of the will, containing the ultimate basis of decision, end quote. Hegel. Quote, Hegel converts every attribute of the constitutional monarch in present-day Europe into absolute self-determination of the will. He does not say the monarch's will is the ultimate decision, but he says the will's ultimate decision is the monarch. The first assertion is empirical. The second twists empirical fact into a metaphysical axiom. End quote. Marx. Through this reversal, empirical, quote, undigested reality becomes sanctified. Concrete material reality, which is disposed of by Hegel's idealist indeterminate abstractions, comes to life again in the, quote, empirical content of his, quote, pure speculation. Hence concludes Della Volpe, from the, quote, sterility and vicious fullness of any reasoning which does not take matter as the extra-rational into proper account, end quote, one has to, quote, infer the positivity and essentiality of matter as a gnosiological element, end quote. Della Volpe. A first positive methodological guideline has thus been found. The second important contribution of the critique is seen in the new method that Marx poses in opposition to Hegel's speculation. Quote, the true philosophical critique of the modern constitution of the state does not point out the contradictions as subsistent. It explains them. It comprehends their genesis, their necessity. It takes them in their specific significance. This comprehension, however, does not consist, as Hegel implies, in again recognizing everywhere the determinations of the logical concept, but in taking up the specific logic of the specific object. End quote. Marx. A specific determinate method is thus set up against idealism's generic and undeterminate abstractions. Della Volpe finds further specifications of both methods in the 1844 manuscripts. The reversal of subject and predicate is again fully exposed. Quote, in Hegel, real man and real nature become mere predicates, symbols of this esoteric unreal man and of his unreal nature. Subjects and predicate are therefore related to each other in absolute reversals, a mystical subject-object, or a subjectivity reaching beyond the object. End quote. Marx. Economic and philosophical manuscripts. That, quote, vicious fullness of empirical content which derives from the fact that Hegel's speculation, quote, leaves things as they are, end quote, is now perspicuously understood as, quote, uncritical positivism, end quote. The, quote, philosophical dissolution and restoration of the existing empirical world, end quote. Marx. Finally, a rough suggestion is laid down that opens the possibility of understanding Marx's own method in terms of its unity with the method of natural science. Quote, history itself is a real part of natural history, of nature developing into man. Natural science will in time incorporate into itself the science of man, just as the science of man will incorporate into itself natural science. There will be one science, end quote. Marx. Turning to the book The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx's ruthless attack on Proudhon's book, Philosophy of Poverty, Della Volpe provides a sharper clarification of the conservative political meaning of speculative dialectic. The inversion of subject and predicate between thing and ideas is neither an innocent scholastic game nor merely a logical, quote, mistake. When one transcends all concrete and real givens and makes them so many abstractions and logical categories, all real transient historical determinations are bound to appear as rational, eternal, and natural. Speculation's political vocation is thereby realized. We live in the best of all possible worlds, and biology is destiny. Quote, economists, says Marx, quote, explain how production takes place in ... bracket, given and bracket relations, but what they do not explain is how these relations themselves are produced, that is, the historical movement which gave them birth, end quote. Marx. If, quote, the economist's material is the active, energetic life of man, and Proudhon's material is the dogma of the economist, but the moment we cease to pursue the historical movement of production relations, of which the categories are but the theoretical expression, the moment we want to see in these categories no more than ideas, spontaneous thoughts independent of real relations, we are forced to attribute the origin of these thoughts to the movement of pure reason. Is it surprising that everything in the final abstraction, for we have here an abstraction, quote, indeterminate abstraction, end quote, comments Della Volpe, and not an analysis, presents itself as a logical category, end quote. Marx. But how does such, quote, abstraction move? Just as we, quote, we have transformed everything into a logical category, so one has only to make an abstraction of every distinctive, bracket, quote, determinate, adds Della Volpe, characteristic of different movements to attain movement in its abstract condition, purely formal movement, the purely logical form of the movement, end quote. Della Volpe. Excuse me, actually, let me repeat that. But how does this such, quote, abstraction move? Just as, quote, we have transformed everything into a logical category, so one has to make an abstraction of every distinctive, bracket, quote, determinate, end quote, adds Della Volpe, in bracket, characteristic of different movements, to attain movement in its abstract condition, purely formal movement, the purely legal form of the movement, end quote. Thus, quote, all things being reduced to a logical category, and every movement, every act of production to method, it follows naturally that every aggregate of products and production, of objects and of movement, can be reduced to a form of applied metaphysics. What Hegel has done for religion, law, etc., Proudhon seeks to do for political economy, end quote. Marx. And here's the conservative political result. Proudhon, says Marx, quote, understands very well that men make cloth, linen, or silk materials in definite relations of production. But what he has not understood is that these definite social relations are just as much produced by men as linen, flax, etc., end quote. Marx. Furthermore, quote, the same men who establish their social relations in conformity with their material productivity produce also principles, ideas, and categories, in conformity with their social relations. Thus these ideas, these categories are as little eternal as the relations they express. They are historical and transitory products. They are historical and transitory products. But when the economists say that present-day relations, the relations of bourgeois production, are natural, they imply that these are the relations in which wealth is created and productive forces developed in conformity with the laws of nature. These relations, therefore, are themselves natural laws, independent of the influence of time. They are eternal laws which must always govern society. Thus there has been a history, but there is no longer any." End quote. Marx. Della Volpe finds the conclusion to all this in a letter to Schweitzer from January 24th, 1865. In the book, The Philosophy of Poverty, says Marx, Proudhon proved, quote, in the book, The Philosophy of Poverty, says Marx, Proudhon proved, quote, how little he has penetrated into the secret of scientific dialectics, and how, on the contrary, he shares the illusions of speculative philosophy in his treatment of the economic categories. How, instead of conceiving them as the theoretical expression of historical relations of production corresponding to a particular stage of development in material production, he transforms them by his twaddle into pre-existing eternal ideas, and in this roundabout way arrives once more at the standpoint of bourgeois economy. End quote. Marx. The antithesis between the standpoint of the antithesis between speculative and scientific dialectic could not be any sharper. The anti-speculative materialist method, which in 1843 Marx defined as a, quote, truly philosophical critique, has now become a, quote, scientific dialectic, end quote. However, scientific dialectic, he now says, has a mystery in itself. According to Della Volpe, the mystery of scientific dialectic is unfolded in the 1857 introduction to the book, A Critique of Political Economy, the crucial text of the entire Reconstruction. In this introduction, the characterization of the speculative method is articulated fully with respect to the abstractions of political economy. At this point level, quote, speculative dialectic is more than that of Hegel, Proudhon, and the, quote, modern economists. It is the method of ideology in general. Furthermore, for Della Volpe, the introduction also clearly defines the, quote, correct method itself is essentially historical and experimental. As such, quote, scientific dialectic, end quote, transcends Marx's own work and is acknowledged as the experimental method of science at large. Quote, production in general, says Marx, quote, is an abstraction, but it is a rational abstraction insofar as it singles out and fixes the common features, thereby saving us repetition, end quote. Marx. In other words, it is a, quote, generic abstraction, end quote, for it takes only the common traits of all real, historical, specific modes of production. Quote, these general or common features discovered by comparison constitute something very complex, whose constituent elements have different destinations. Some of these elements belong to all epochs, others are common only to a few. Some of them are common to the most modern as well as the most ancient epochs. No production is conceivable without them, but while even the most completely developed languages have laws and conditions in common with the least developed ones, what is characteristic of their development are the points of departure from the general and the common. The conditions that generally govern production, therefore, must be differentiated in order that the essential points of difference not be lost sight of in view of the general uniformity which is due to the fact that the subject, mankind, and the object, nature, remain the same. End quote, Marx. In other words, The essential point of differences are not taken into account. Any real concrete mode of production vanishes in the ideal abstraction of production in general. Here, says Marx, lies the quote wisdom of modern economists who are trying to prove the eternal nature and harmony of existing social conditions, unquote. No production is possible without means of production and stored up labor. Capital is both a means of production and stored up labor. No production is possible without capital. Quote, hence capital, unquote, states Marx ironically, quote, is a universal, eternal, and natural phenomenon, which is true if we disregard the specific properties which turn a, quote, instrument of production and, quote, stored up labor into capital, end quote. First, modern economists take capitalist production as production tout court. Then they proceed to, quote, prove that it is irreplaceable. First, reality becomes an idea, then the idea is taken as real. The process of hypostatization is complete. No production is possible without appropriation. Private property is appropriation. Quote, therefore, no production is possible without private property. The sanctification of existing conditions assumes the mask of sheer common sense. If these are the results of speculation, what would the method of science be like? How can we avoid generic abstractions? For Della Volpe, the answer lies in chapter 3 of this introduction. Quote, it is, necessary to follow a, quote, scientifically correct, unquote, method, i.e., first of all, to move toward abstractions, without which no thought or knowledge is possible, starting from the, quote, concrete subject, end quote, which is in this case a historically, quote, given society. If in order to explain the whole process of production, we start from the population as its basis, without taking into account, quote, classes, and the concrete historical elements which constitute them, such as wage, labor, capital, etc. In so doing, we proceed from a, quote, imaginary, concrete, toward less and less complex abstractions. And this is the method of bourgeois political economy, But Marx continues, if once we have reached the simplest abstractions, we, quote, start on our return journey, end quote, until we, quote, finally come back to population as a rich aggregate of many concepts and relations, end quote, In so doing, we follow the correct method, for which, quote, the abstract definitions lead to the reproduction of the concrete in the movement of thought, end quote. Marx, end quote, Galvano Della Volpe. Thus, Della Volpe concludes, quote, the correct method can be represented as a circular movement from the concrete or real to the abstract or ideal, and from the latter back to the former. This means precisely a continuous, unavoidable historical verification of economic abstractions as categories. End quote. These verified categories and abstractions will be specific, determinate concepts. Scientific dialectic, therefore, is but the experimental method itself, always starting from a real concrete problem, proceeding to a rational, and in this sense, quote, abstract hypothesis, and finally coming back to concreteness for the verification. It is at this point, Della Volpe feels, that the remarks on the unity of natural and social sciences, quote, there will be one science, end quote, in the 1844 manuscripts make sense. For, quote, there is but one science, end quote, and, quote, there is but one method, i.e. one logic, the materialist logic of modern experimental science, The techniques which constitute the physical, the economic, and the social law are certainly as different as the respective experiences and realities are, But the method is one. Whose symbol will be the concrete, abstract, concrete circle. In social science, this method of verification means, for Della Volpe, a, quote, historical experimental restatement of categories, unquote, or a verification of sociological and economic concepts in terms of real, concrete, and specific modes of production. What is implied in the, quote, experimental restatement, unquote, is first that, as Marx writes, we cannot take economic categories simply, quote, in the order in which they were the determining factor in the course of history, end quote. Their order of sequence, quote, is rather determined by the relation which they bear to one another in modern bourgeois society, and which, to the exact opposite of what seems to be their natural order, or the order of their historical development, end quote. Marx. For instance, quote, nothing seems more natural than to start from the rent with landed properties, since it is bound up with land, the source of all production and exchange, and with the first form of production, i.e. agriculture, end quote. Marx. Capital itself, quote, with the exception of purely monetary capital, has, the characteristic of land ownership in the Middle Ages, end quote. Marx. But the, quote, reverse is true of bourgeois society, end quote, where, quote, agriculture comes to be more and more a branch of industry and is completely dominated by capital, The same is true of rent, Rent cannot be understood without capital, while capital can be understood without rent, end quote. Capital, therefore, and not rent, quote, must form the starting point as well as the end, and must be developed before land ownership is, end quote. Marx. For Della Volpe, this is an example of the experimental method at work. Sorry. As the movement from concrete to abstract to concrete, we start from capital and we end with capital as the present in the concrete. The present from which we start, says Della Volpe, is itself, quote, the result of a historical process, end quote. Our search for causes, therefore, quote, must become a search for historical antecedents, end quote. Not every chronological precedent, however, can count as a cause for the present. Only the precedent which is not, quote, accidental, but, quote, logical can be taken as a cause. We begin with the concrete and move to its logical antecedents, the abstract. What is implied in this process is, quote, a choice of those precedents which are logical and historical antecedents of our present, unquote, Della Volpe. In this way, the present, quote, utilizes and develops, end quote, these antecedents and makes them into, quote, concepts and criteria which are meant to solve its specific new problems, end quote, Della Volpe. We have thus returned to the level of the concrete. Such concepts and criteria, in fact, count as, quote, experimental criteria, end quote, or, quote, models for actions and events, end quote, Della Volpe. This point is crucial, for it represents Della Volpe's way of unifying politics and science. Not only does the experimental structure of Marx's dialectic hold for both natural and social sciences, but for revolutionary social practice as well. Quote, human social practice must cooperate with the theoretical objectivity of our hypotheses. End quote. Della Volpe. In this way, our practice will count as, quote, historical experiment, end quote, proper, and the relationship between reason and matter will now be seen as, quote, mutual functionality of ideology and action, end quote. For, quote, it is in practice or in action that theory as truth must be confirmed and affirmed. For, quote, it is in practice or in action that theory as truth must be confirmed and affirmed, end quote. Marx. Della Volpe. Thus, the, quote, specific logic of the sub-specific object, end quote, outlined by Marx in the 1843 Critique, quote, can only mean the experimental logic, i.e. the law, which represents the solution to philosophical or, quote, ethical problems as much as to, quote, physical problems, end quote. Della Volpe. The very, quote, demonstration of the necessity of the transition and historical development, end quote, from capitalism to socialism, quote, relies on the cognitive and gnosiological instrument, which is the dialectical analysis, end quote. Della Volpe. The internal contradiction of capitalism, as the contradiction between the social character of labor and the private character of capital, prefigures the hypothesis of socialism as the necessary solution. Beyond Marx's commitment to revolution, Della Volpe sees the working of the experimental method itself. It is from such a specific experimental viewpoint that Della Volpe agrees with Guattari. Quote, from a Marxist perspective, the scientist and the moralist coincide, end quote. Roger Guattari. As we have seen, the methodological unity of social and natural science is the essential feature of Della Volpe's reflection. According to him, the logic and methodology that characterize both Marx's work and the work of the physicist constitute the modern critical synthesis of the two classical philosophical approaches to knowledge: induction, analysis, and matter on the one hand, deduction, synthesis, and reason on the other. Different logical principles are involved in the two approaches. Induction implies the principle of non-contradiction. A equals A, B equals B, but A does not equal B. Deduction implies the critique of this principle and its substitution with its negation, A equals B. The inductive analytical statement is exclusive, either this or that, while the deductive synthetic statement is inclusive, both this and that, or, quote, tautoetherology, end quote. Della Volpe. Fundamentally, for Della Volpe, induction implies the recognition of matter as that which is outside reason, while deduction implies the negation of matter and the reduction of matter as the finite to thought as the infinite. Della Volpe finds in Marx a systematic critique of the deductive, idealist, speculative approach in the science of man. As far as the science of nature is concerned, Galileo's criticism of deductive, peripatetic physics is seen as the precise counterpart of Marx's anti-idealist critique. Like Hegel, scholastic physics disregards reality or immediately reduces reality to the idea. In Galileo's Dialogo dei Massimi Sistemi, Sagredo says to Simplicio, quote, you, together with Aristotle, start out by turning me away from the tangible world and point out to me the architecture which it ought to be built, end quote. Thus, the objects of the scholastic physics, as much as those of idealist philosophy, are not facts but ideas. Hegel's cognitive failure is that of Simplicio. Both end up where they had started. In both cases, the negation of matter is crucial. It is from the sterility of all idealist approaches that Della Volpe infers, as we have seen, quote, the positivity and essentiality of matter as a gnosiological element, end quote. Della Volpe. Materialism, therefore, constitutes the necessary basis for formulating the scientific experiment. No hypothesis can be proven without verification. No deduction can be cognitively successful if it does not meet with induction. A result which does not test itself against matter will condemn itself to failure. The experimental method, therefore, needs a true theory of matter. Materialism, however, does not mean sheer induction. Scientific methodology contains a critique of empiricism as well. If pure synthesis or reason alone cannot give us the truth, analysis without synthesis and matter without reason also remain empty. They do not acquire meaning. They do not acquire meaning. Against scholastic physics and Hegelian philosophy, Galileo and Marx do not propose sheer induction. The facts do not speak for themselves. Questions have to be asked. A verification must have something to verify. Deduction and induction, synthesis and analysis must be mutually functional. Quote, against Bacon's purely inductive science, and against empiricist and positivistic science at large, which remains suspicious of all hypotheses, regarded as, quote, premature anticipations, end quote, of nature, ... Galileo makes use of an induction, end quote, which does not consist in a mere search for, quote, empirical constants, end quote, or generic abstractions, but starts from that particular type of experience, which is the experiment, quote, insofar as it is always the experiment of a hypothesis idea. I'm going to repeat that. Insofar as it is always the experiment of a hypothesis idea, end quote, Della Volpe. And at the same time, quote, against scholastic, purely deductive science, ... Galileo makes use of a deduction, ... We find the proof of the truth of its hypothesis, ... not just in itself, ... but in the experiment, end quote. Della Volpe. Next to a true theory of matter, therefore, scientific dialectic needs a true theory of reason. A true theory of reason is precisely what Marx owes to Hegel. This original point of Della Volpe's has been elaborated upon by Lucio Coletti. Quote, the famous, quote, rational kernel of Hegel's dialectic is precisely his theory of reason, ... The greatness of this theory becomes apparent if one realizes that only Hegel has been able to develop coherently the idea that thought is not an object, that reason is not a positive or a thing. In all previous philosophies, in fact, the infinite has always been conceived as separate from the finite, end quote. Coletti. Thought has always been held as separate from reality. Infinitude or thought lay at one side opposed to finitude, as reality on the other. But if the infinite is taken as only one of the two, it becomes reduced to a finite. Quote, the only way, therefore, to conceive coherently the infinite or thought, the only way to think the negative in an adequate manner, lies in the understanding that the negative is negative precisely because it is not, quote, one of the two, end quote. It is not, quote, this in opposition to, quote, that. It is, quote, both this and that, end quote, or comprehension of the whole opposition, end quote. It follows that, quote, the only way to conceive of the infinite coherently and without contradiction lies in conceiving of it as dialectical and contradiction. As dialectic and contradiction, end quote. And that quote's from Coletti. Reason as negative and reason as dialectic. This is Marx's starting point. Reason as negative. Reason as negative means that reason cannot be separated from matter and cannot stand by reason's self. Marx's, quote, reversal of idealist dialectic, or his, quote, introduction of materialism in gnoseology, unquote, consists of the fact that having understood, bracket, with Hegel, and bracket, that reason is a negative, and that it therefore cannot be by itself as a substratum and a subject, he takes it as a function, or predicate of positive, end quote. Ideas are not things but functions of things. Thought is not an object, but a function of the real object. Deduction cannot be a separate process. It must be a function of experience. Reason is dialectic. Reason is dialectic points to the experimental method as well. For example, quote, "It is impossible to understand abstract labor. Abstract labor, its difference from all other labors, if one does not compare abstract labor with, and therefore relate it to, useful or concrete labor." End quote. Coletti. And it is reason alone that can take both labors together. However, this operation of relating or including, and this understanding of what is common to two labors, are in themselves a function of a different operation. I relate abstract labor to concrete labor, the productive labor of capitalist society, to that of all previous societies. Or I include concrete labor in my understanding of abstract labor, precisely because I need, quote, to know what I must exclude, or put aside as inessential, when I come to define the productive labor of capitalist society. The productive labor of capitalist society, bracket, abstract labor, in bracket, end quote. Quote, "What is general and common to all objects or real beings," end quote. In other words, quote, "is not in itself an object or a being, it is only an idea," end quote. Coletti. Production, quote, "in general, is no real production. Property tout court is no concrete historical form of property." Here lies Hegel's fundamental mistake. Hegel takes the, quote, "rational totality as the true concrete," end quote. For Della Volpe and Coletti, the trouble with Hegel is not to be found in the often presumed contradiction between a, quote, "good" method and a, quote, "bad system, as in a poor application of an otherwise correct methodology. Hegel's mistake, the unresolved contradiction, is that, quote, "he rightly conceived of thought as negativity and relation, while at the same time kept the fundamental idealistic assumption. He shared the religious Christian thesis that the finite, the world, all real things, do not exist by themselves, but are something created, secondary, and dependent," end quote. Coletti. In other words, Hegel held a true theory of reason with a false premise, idealism. It is because of this contradiction that in the development of a new methodology, we have encountered Hegel two times. First Hegel the idealist, then Hegel the theoretician of reason. If both matter and reason have to meet in the dialectical process, so do their respective logical principles. Insofar as thought as relation and inclusion is involved in the formulation of the hypothesis, the logical principle of tautoetherology, as the unity of opposites, quote, "both this and that," end quote, is also involved. Insofar as reality, as division and exclusion, quote, "either this or that," end quote, is needed to set up the experiment, the principle of identity is needed as well. Therefore, the logic of Marxism and the logic of Galileo, in a word, the modern logic of science, has to acknowledge as its basis a new logical principle, the principle of tautoetherological identity. Tautoetherological identity, as a relationship of unity and distinction. Identity or distinction on the one hand, because thought is a specific function of reality, and, quote, ideas are not immediately, quote, things. Tautoetherology, or unity, on the one hand, on the other, or unity on the other, because thought as a function is part of reality as a whole, and, quote, ideas are functions of, quote, things. The Marxist theory of dialectic is, quote, at once a theory of both the unity and the exclusion of opposites. It is a theory that tries to guarantee at the same time both the moment of knowledge and that of reality, end quote, itself. From this point of view, materialist dialectic and scientific experiment fully and completely coincide, sociology can again be a materialist science. And that's the end of the piece proper. Now I'm going to read the endnotes, which are fairly extensive. See Eric Fromm, Socialist Humanism. It says, Della Volpe taught for decades in the Provincial University of Messina, Sicily. It says, for a recent exposition of the history of the relation between Lukács and the official, quote, Marxist-Leninist line, see Paul Brynis's article, Introduction to Lukács, The Old Culture and the New, published in Telos in 1970. It says, the existence of a common Hegelian matrix in the two schools is shown in Lucio Coletti's book, Il Marxismo e Hegel. For him, the derivation of dialectical materialism from Hegel contains a fundamental philosophical oversight. Quote, the sense and the function of the, quote, dialectic of matter, end quote, in Hegel's thought is, in Hegel's own words, the following, quote, the dialectic of matter constitutes an essential moment of every religious consciousness, end quote. The sense that the, quote, dialectic of matter, end quote, comes to assume in Engels and in Lenin is, as it is well known, quite another. To them, it constitutes the most mature and the highest form of materialism. At this point, one could hypothesize that the same name, bracket, quote, dialectic of matter, end quote, end bracket, may be concealing two different philosophical conceptions. This hypothesis, however, must be rejected. All fundamental statements of the, quote, dialectic of matter, end quote, have been originally formulated by Hegel. Dialectical materialism has simply transcribed them into its text. But since in this transcription the authors of dialectical materialism have clearly shown that they believe that those statements imply, already in Hegel's own text, a materialistic assumption, we have to conclude quite simply that they have made a mistake. This mistake, however, has represented the basis of about a century of theoretical Marxism, end quote. Coletti. It says, see the author's article, on the methodology of determinate abstraction, essay on Galvano Della Volpe, published in Telos, 1971. It says, as the readers will see, this is literally true. I don't know what this is. Since Della Volpe considers himself an interpreter, a good deal of his work take the form of commentary on Marx's own writings and are crammed with long pages of quotations. One of his merits is that he called our attention to Marxian texts which have generally been overlooked, particularly the critique of Hegel's philosophy of state and the 1857 introduction to a contribution to the critique of political economy. In an attempt to convey this, quote, philological message, my exposition will follow Della Volpe's guidelines. I will quote Marx at great length. It says, the particular attention that Della Volpe gives to the 1843 critique remains one of the characteristic features of his reflection, in direct opposition to the, quote, Western exegetes, who focus particularly on the manuscripts. He finds the critique, quote, more important even if much less studied both in Italy and abroad, because it contains the most general premises of a new philosophical method in the form of a critique of Hegelian logic, which unmasks the, quote, mystifications of the a priori idealist and speculative dialectic, end quote. Della Volpe in Rousseau et Marx. The critique is for Della Volpe the crucial text of Marx's, quote, epistemological break, end quote. Here lies a major difference with Della Volpe and Althusser. Althusser definitely overlooks the importance of the critique, as well as the other 1840 to 1844, quote, early works, which he sees as still Feuerbachian in essence. See Althusser's For Marx. It says, so do Lloyd D. Easton and Kurt H. Godot, the American editors of the book Writings of the Young Marx on Philosophy and Society, published in 1967, who have chosen to include the critique under the heading, quote, Feuerbachian critique of criticism of Hegel, end quote. The essential difference between Marx's and Feuerbach's criticism of Hegel lies in the fact that Feuerbach characterizes the Hegelian abstraction as empty, robbed of empirical content, whereas Marx sees it in Della Volpe's words, quote, viciously full of empirical content, end quote. The meaning of such, quote, vicious fullness, end quote, will become clear later in this essay. It says, for a characterization of these two modes of abstraction with reference to the methodology of political economy, see Maurice Dobbs' book, Political Economy and Capitalism. Quote, in making abstractions of particular elements in a situation, there are, broadly speaking, two roads along which one can proceed. In the first place, one may build one's abstraction on the exclusion of certain features which are present in any actual situation, either because they are quantitatively of lesser importance in determining the course of the event, or because they are more variable. To omit them from consideration makes the resulting calculation no more than an imperfect approximation to reality, but nevertheless makes it a very much more reliable guide than if the major factors had been omitted and only the minor influences taken into account. So it is that one creates the abstraction of a projectile which moves in a vacuum, in order to estimate what are the dominant factors which will govern the trajectory of an object propelled through a resistant medium. The correctness or otherwise of the particular assumption chosen can only be determined by experience, by knowledge of how actual situations behave, and of the actual difference made by the presence or absence of various factors. Secondly, one may base one's abstractions not on any evidence of fact as to what features in a situation are essential and what are inessential, but simply on the formal procedure of combining the properties common to a heterogeneous assortment of situations and building abstraction out of analogy. Within limits, of course, such a method is not only perfectly valid, but is an essential element in any generalization. A generalization is no generalization, but an imaginary hypothesis, unless what it generalizes is something common to the phenomena to which it refers. The danger of the method is of its being pushed too far, beyond the point where the factors which it embraces cease to be the major factors determining the nature of the problem which is in hand. Here exists the serious danger of hypostatizing one's concepts, of regarding the postulated relations as the determining ones in any actual situation, instead of contingent and determined by other features, and hence of presuming too readily that they will apply to novel or imperfectly known situations, with an abstract dogmatism as the result. End quote. Maurice Dobbs, Political Economy and Capitalism, 1937. End footnote. It says, published in Poverty, I guess that's Poverty Philosophy, page 197. For a counterexample, Della Volpe sends us back to Marx's Capital's footnote on Proudhon's political proposal. Quote, Proudhon begins by taking his ideal of justice, quote, justice éternelle, from the juridical relations that correspond to the production of commodities, Then he turns around and seeks to reform the actual production of commodities and the actual legal system corresponding thereto, in accordance with this ideal. What opinion should we have of a chemist who, instead of studying the actual laws of the molecular changes in the composition and decomposition of matter, and on that foundation solving definite problems, claimed to regulate the composition and decomposition of matter by means of the, quote, eternal ideas of, quote, naturalité, end quote, and, quote, affinité, end quote. Do we really know any more about, quote, usury when we say it contradicts, quote, justice éternelle, quote, équité éternelle, and other, quote, vérités éternelles, quote, than the fathers of the church did when they said it was incompatible with, quote, grâce éternelle, foi éternelle, and la volonté éternelle de Dieu, end quote. Marx. It says, the reactionary political meaning of the speculative method was fully exposed in the manifesto. Quote, the abolition of existing property relations is not at all a distinctive feature of communism. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. ... You are horrified at our doing away with private property, but in your existing society, private property is already done away for 9/10 of the population. ... In a word, you reproach us for intending to do away with your property. Precisely so. That is just what we intend. End quote. Communist Manifesto. It says Marx's method is, quote, an adequate logical method, end quote, only because it is, quote, the historical method stripped of ... those chronological elements which are in fact accidental, non-essential, irrational, end quote. It is therefore, quote, a method of elimination of all irrational precedents, end quote. I'm not sure that's from. It says from the Greek tautos and, quote, etheros, the same and the other. The same and the other. There's a piece, the Marxism as Sociology is in fact the title of one of Coletti's earliest essays, forthcoming in the volume Ideology and Society, a main thesis of the Della Volpean school. In this essay, Coletti elaborates on a number of important consequences of Della Volpe's methodological reflection. His characterization of idealist and positivist trends in sociology, in terms of their modes of abstraction, is particularly noteworthy. Coletti examines the genesis of the concept of, quote, society in general, and, quote, social system, quote, community, typical of so much of contemporary, quote, sociological theory, end quote. The sociologists who deal with society in general, he writes, are the ones who hold that societies have to be studied at the level of ideological social relations alone, or the ones who believe that the specific element of ... human societies lies in, quote, consciousness, end quote, end quote. At this point, says Coletti, quote, they are dealing with mere products or moments of thought. Their analyses no longer concern a real object, but a merely ideal one, end quote. Coletti. As the real object vanishes, they will find it impossible to undertake the study of facts and concrete social processes, for, quote, they do not confront a specific society. All they have is the idea of society in general, end quote. However, to substitute, quote, material for, quote, ideological analysis, technology's history for the history of ideas would not be a solution. Quote, if any given society is bound to vanish into society in general as soon as its ideology alone is examined, to the exclusion of material production relations, the same thing will happen when only material production is taken into account, to the exclusion of all ideological relations. What is to become of, quote, production, if one abstracts from that which makes of material production, a production of ideas, and of interhuman relations as well? Clearly, production will be reduced to the relationship of single men to nature, i.e. to a pre-social fact. ... In the first case, when only ideological relations are taken into account. Society disappears in the spirit. In the second, when the material level is analyzed alone, society vanishes into the large frame of, quote, nature. The only way to deal with a, quote, concrete society, therefore, lies in taking together production and distribution, material and social relations, economic structure and politico-ideological level, substructure and superstructure. But this becomes possible only if one draws from reality itself, thereby breaking with the method of indeterminate or generic abstraction, which can only produce the twofold abstraction of Monsieur l'Esprit and Madame la Matière. End quote. And that's from Lucio Coletti's article, Marxism as Sociology. I regret that the monographic character of this essay does not allow for the discussion of Coletti's own thought. Lucio Coletti is an open-minded original thinker. Although he did start from Della Volpe's theoretical platform, his research has gone far beyond Della Volpe's philosophical guidelines. For a sample of his work, see his article Power and Democracy in Socialist Society, published in New Left Review, 1969. Okay, and that is the end of the piece by Mario Montano, titled, the quote, Scientific Dialectics of Galvano Della Volpe. Thank you so much for listening.